Okay, we'll now take a look at problem 17-2A. And if you're using the full textbook, financial and managerial, that's 17-2A. If you're using only the managerial textbook, that's 2-2A. Either way, the title of the chapter is Job Order Costing, and it's the 2A problem. Let's go through it. They're using a job order cost system, and we're going to look at journal entries that would be required there, and then go through some other steps as well in determining the balances of some of the accounts and prepare a couple of supporting schedules. Okay, Tybee Industries uses a job order cost system. The following data summarize the operations related to production for January 2016, the first month of operations. Okay, if they're using a job order cost system, you guys, then it's easy for them to identify a specific job. And then, since it's easy for them to identify a specific job, what they're going to do is assign cost to that particular job. Okay, so let's go through the journal entries first. That's instruction 1. It says journalize the entries to record the summarized operations. Okay, we'll do that on our journal page here, and we'll have to move over for some of these supporting schedules. But on instruction 1, we'll start with the journal entries. A reads, materials purchased on account, $29,800. Okay, well, we're going to debit. They just call it materials. Some books you would see raw materials inventory. I think that's what I've called it in your notes. I usually, in class, if I were doing this on the board, I would definitely call it materials inventory. But that's not important as long as you realize that materials, work in process, and finished goods are all inventory accounts. They're not going to use the word inventory after them here in the account title, but remember, they are inventory accounts. So these are raw materials purchased, or materials that we're going to keep in the warehouse until we're ready to enter them into the production process. And we'll put them on the books at their cost, $29,800. Okay, it says they were purchased on account, so we'll credit accounts payable for the same amount, $29,800. Okay, on B, they say materials requisitioned and factory labor used. Okay, and they go through job numbers 301 through 306. You guys, if it's materials and labor used on specific jobs, then that's going to be a part of work in process inventory. If it's materials and labor used for general factory use, those would be indirect materials and indirect labor, and those will be a part of factory overhead. So what we want to do is first we want to debit the inventory account, the asset, work in process. And now this is an inventory account or an asset account. All inventory accounts are asset accounts, of course. Not all asset accounts are inventory accounts. I'm sure you know that. But we're going to debit work in process for everything in both columns on B, except for that bottom row that reads for general factory use. So we want to include all the materials and all the labor used on specific jobs. In this case, jobs 301 through 306. So I'm going to just add them in here as I go. I'm going to start down the materials column, 2960 plus 3620 plus 2400 plus 8100 plus 5100 plus 3750. Okay, and that takes care of all the materials used on specific jobs. We also want to include, though, in work in process, all the labor used on specific jobs. So I'm going to start back with 301. Factory labor there was 2775. So plus 2775 plus 3750 plus 1875 plus 6860 plus 5250 plus 3340. Now that's all the materials and all the labor used on specific jobs. In this case, jobs 301 through 306. And that's our debit to the work in process inventory account. 49,780. Now just to show you, and you've realized this by now, I think, 49,780. I don't want to forget what that was. I'm going to write it down. But just for instance, had we put in 50,000, you get that red dot showing that it's incorrect. I'm sure you're aware of that by now. But 49,780 was it. Okay, now we're going to debit factory overhead for indirect materials and indirect labor, which would be materials and labor used in the factory but not used on specific jobs. So the materials and labor could be cleaning supplies and janitorial services, for instance. Could be other things. But any materials used in the factory that were not a part of jobs 301 through 306 would be indirect materials. And any labor in the factory that was not labor time spent on specific jobs would be a part of factory overhead. Now our actual factory overhead costs, such as these, go on the books as a debit. Later on, our estimate of factory overhead, so that we can cost the jobs as soon as they're completed, our estimate of factory overhead is what will actually be included in work in process. Our estimate of factory overhead will go on the books as a credit. We hope the estimate is exactly equal to our debits, meaning that we estimated overhead perfectly. That's not going to be the case, or hardly ever would that be the case, that our estimate would be perfect. But we hope that our estimate is as close as possible. We'll talk more about that later on. But here, to get the debit to factory overhead, we're going to add together indirect materials, or the materials that on the row that read for general factory use. So 1,080 plus 4,100, and that gets us 5,180. Okay, now for materials, well, the materials moved out of the materials account and into work in process or factory overhead. So we want to credit materials, the asset inventory account, for everything in the materials column. Now it looks like they did, we get a red dot here, so it looks like they did labor first. For our factory labor, we're going to credit wages payable. It looks like that's the one they're going with first for some reason. You'd think they'd use materials first because it was in the left-hand column, but anyway, we normally read left to right. But we're going to credit wages payable, you guys, for everything in the labor column, including the bottom row. We have to pay our employees whether they're working on specific jobs or if they're just doing general factory labor. So we want to add up everything in the factory labor column. So it's 2775 plus 3750 plus 1875 plus 6860 plus 5250 plus 3340 plus 4100. So everything in the labor column to get your credit there. And then we're going to credit materials. We credited wages payable because we have to pay our employees for all the work performed for specific jobs and for general factory use. So we'll credit this for everything in the labor column. And then we're going to credit materials, which were moved out of our raw materials inventory account and into either work in process or factory overhead. If they were direct materials, they become a part of work in process. That's materials used on specific jobs. If they were indirect materials, they become a part of factory overhead. But either way, they were moved out of the materials warehouse and into the production facility itself. Here we'll credit the materials account for everything in the materials column. So that's 2960 plus 3620 plus 2400 plus 8100 plus 5100 plus 3750 plus 1080. Now, if you'll notice, that entry balances. If you add your two debits together, subtract your two credits, you're going to come out to zero. So let's go back through this one. This one gets missed on the homework and on the test, probably more than any of the rest. You want to debit work in process for all the materials and all the labor used on specific jobs. So on jobs 301 through 306, you want to add up everything in the materials column and everything in the factory labor column. That's this number. Our debit to factory overhead is for that bottom row, materials and factory labor on that bottom row that reads for general factory use, the 1080 plus the 4100. Our credit to wages payable is for everything in the factory labor column, including the bottom row. And our credit to materials is for everything in the materials column, including that bottom row. Okay, we'll pick back up with C in the next video. Thanks.